So just a reminder, the presentation today is basically we took everybody who submitted their survey through the University of Alabama at Birmingham. We combined all of those results together. And what we're giving you is an aggregated picture of what we learned from 30 by 30 participating agencies. The data that you're going to see right now is, I believe it's 29 or 30 agencies that participated. There's another 4 agencies who are waiting for the results from University of Alabama at Birmingham, and those are not reflected here. Thank you for your patience. I know it's Dallas, University of Texas, and I forget who the other 2 are, but I'm told as of this morning that they are very, very, very close to finishing. They want to make sure that they're getting everything right. And I appreciate that diligence on the part of the researchers. So let's go ahead and just dive right in. We got, with all of those different agency responses, over 600 responses. There's 250 responses outstanding. That sample size of 850 responses from women officers in policing, as far as we can tell, is probably one of the largest, if not the largest data set around that really explores what it is that women are experiencing on the force. We think that the researchers are going to be able to do a very sort of rigorous analysis of that data, identify trends along things like demographic lines, or are there differences between agency size, geographic location, time on the force. It's a really, really exciting moment, and you all have contributed very significantly to building the evidence base around women in policing, and we could not be more grateful for that. If you didn't submit your surveys through the University of Alabama at Birmingham, either because you weren't comfortable with that model, which is understandable, or you just didn't get it out in time, but you're going to get it out soon. If you're using the same questions from that survey template that we sent around, and you're willing to share your data with me, I can add it to the data set on the back end. So we would have, even more responses and an even fuller picture of what's happening in this country. Absolutely no pressure to do that. Again, all of this is voluntary. If you're not sure, you want me to talk to lawyers or risk managers or whoever, happy to get on the phone and just chat it through with your jurisdiction. I want to flag that this webinar is how I will be sharing these aggregated results. We're not going to issue a report because there's only this sort of top line level of analysis, and it doesn't mean much unless you also do that sort of deep dive into the different types of variables that could impact these results. And I don't want to paint an unclear picture. I think for the purposes of understanding trends and informing what you prioritize in your pledge, this is hugely helpful. But for use as sort of a deeply analyzed body of data, it's not appropriate to publish it at this point. So if you didn't hear results that you were hoping to hear on this webinar, call me and we can have a conversation about what those aggregated results are. The other thing I don't want is for these aggregated results to get out and become like this proxy benchmark, right? So as your agency, if for example, you issued a report, right? You issued your survey through the University of Alabama at Birmingham, you have your report and you're comparing your results to the results you're seeing here. It's possible your agency did below average, right? But we're not trying to suggest that these numbers are benchmarks. And we don't want agencies to be set up to be criticized because they're below the average, because this isn't a nationally representative sample. So it's better to keep this close to the vest for now until there's a much more rigorous analysis. But like I said, you've got questions about how you compare and you're not hearing it today, call me and we can talk through it. Some things we're definitely going to be looking into in the future are things like intersectionality. Are the experiences of women different depending on their race and ethnicity, their sexual orientation, their gender identity? Does time on the job make a difference? Does the agency size or location make a difference? So like I said, over the next couple of years, we'll have a much more nuanced understanding that we can share with you and hopefully inform some of your efforts that way. Why we're bothering to talk about these aggregated results. So one, like I said, if you've done the survey, you can compare your results to what the group, how the group performed. If you haven't, this is going to give you a little bit of an insight of the likely trends that you can expect. But really the entire point of today is to do a deep dive into the results that are most relevant for the action items that you have on your pledge, hopefully to inform how it is that you'll be making a difference in these areas moving forward. Okay, first up is some insights relevant to recruitment. So we had a few questions that really were diving into women's experiences of why did you want to become a police officer? What were your career aspirations at the outset? And how have those aspirations changed? What are your career aspirations currently? Here, we're just looking at the data around what career aspirations were when they first joined the force. And I want to draw your attention to the fact that obtain a specialty assignment, stay on patrol, and promote to leadership make up 85% of the responses. That is really helpful insight for recruitment material. If those are the things that motivated the women on your force to join your force when they did, that might be good to highlight in your recruitment material. This is sort of a different way of coming at that Charleston PD study where they asked, undergraduate students, what's most compelling to them here? You're basically getting insights from the women you have. What's most compelling? Why did you want to be a police officer? So that's, I think, certainly very helpful to keep in mind. I'll be sending out these slides too, if anybody has any questions or is trying to write anything down. We had a lot of questions around mentorship and professional development. And I think these answers were actually a little bit more positive than some of us were anticipating. And you'll see that's actually a theme throughout. I'll rip the Band-Aid off now and say that by and large, things are going fairly well, particularly compared to some of the previous research that's out there about these issue areas. So 63% of respondents reported having a significant mentor, which is fantastic, though it does mean that 37% reported that they did not have a significant mentor. This is where that analysis around things like time on the job is going to be very helpful, because it's entirely reasonable that somebody who just stepped their foot in the door doesn't yet have a significant mentor. Importantly, were any of your significant mentors women? Again, this was a result that was surprisingly high to us and I think is very encouraging. 62% reported that they did have a woman as a significant mentor in their career, and 38% reported that they had not. I think the most interesting finding here is the large pie chart in the middle of your slide here, and that's who were your mentors. The largest representation here is from peers. So I think a lot of time when we think about mentorship programs, we think of something very formal. It's a supervisee-supervisor relationship. And we're finding that for women officers and agencies across the country, peers are the ones who are most often serving that role. And we'll talk a little bit about what that might mean for how you can build out mentorship in your agency. The importance of peers in policing is sort of having a moment. You think about programs like EPIC and ABLE that really focus on peer-to-peer interventions to prevent bad outcomes. Well, this data suggests that peers are a really great source for improving good outcomes and empowering officers. So with that in mind, is there a way to build this into some type of training curriculum? It's not just about peer-to-peer intervention. Is it also about sort of the power of peer mentorship and the impact one person can have on their colleague? It's incredibly important and I think very undervalued in most agencies and in most workplaces writ broad. The other implication here is really the importance of exploring mentorship programs through organizations like NOLI. The mentorship numbers were high, but there were still almost 40% of people who didn't have a significant mentor. Of the people who had mentors, 40% of them had not had a woman mentor. So NOLI is an excellent source of how to sort of fill that gap and really sort of buttress your own efforts with external resources. Like I said, we're flying, so please don't hesitate to throw up the flag if you want a little more time with any of these slides. The area where we dove the deepest into this survey for the purposes of this presentation is around promotions, because there's a lot of different facets to what it is we need to explore around promotions in order to achieve the elements of the pledge. So I will say there are aspects of the promotions data that are incredibly encouraging. So first we asked, has anybody actually reached out and encouraged you to promote for any reason? Great numbers there, 72% reported having been encouraged. That does mean 28% reported that they had not yet been encouraged. Again, that's not necessarily all bad, right? Perhaps it is people who are earlier in their career, or perhaps they, are not yet eligible for that kind of thing. It's also not necessarily true that everyone could and should be promoted. So I don't think we're ever going to be looking for 100 there. And I know the researchers were pretty happy with the numbers that we saw there. I think the most exciting aspect of all of this is if you look, and I know it's really small, sorry about that, but if you look at who encouraged you, this was an open-ended question. So respondents were free to answer however they wanted in narrative form. Most people ended up responding about sorry, RF, I muted you. So most people responded with information about the person's rank and information about the person's gender. And if you look here, it's a little bit of everything. Both genders, both supervisors, higher ranked people, mentors, people who were subordinates, family members, peers, both genders were named in terms of who had actually encouraged people to promote. This is where it gets a little bit interesting. So only 17% reported having been actively discouraged. And again, I think we were a little heartened by those numbers. But when you look into who did the discouraging, again, that was an open-ended narrative field. And while we saw equal representation or near equal representation of both genders across all ranks in who encouraged you, in terms of who discouraged you, we saw very, very little representation of women here. So by and large, when people named someone who had discouraged them specifically, it was generally a man, usually supervisor or higher rank or peer. That is, I think, a little bit interesting. You know, a lot of what we end up discussing when we speak about this publicly at conferences is that sort of crabs in a bucket syndrome, where because there are so few opportunities, sometimes women might try to keep other women down. And we've certainly heard anecdotal stories about that, but what the data is showing here, that's not necessarily the case in terms of encouragement or discouragement for promotion. The other thing I want to note here, because I think it's a little bit more complex to address, is oh, did somebody stop me?
Yeah, could I jump in for 1 second? Just ask.
Yes.
This is Deanna Cantrell. I'm the police chief in Fairfield, California.
Hello.
So I find that the data interesting, but given that, you know, at the chief rank, police chiefs, at the female police chiefs make up, you know, 2 to 3% of police chiefs. And so we know that as you go up in rank as a female, it gets less and less and less. And so wouldn't it make common sense that male supervisors would, I mean, because they make up the vast majority of supervisors in law enforcement anyway, that that they would be higher in number?
Excellent point, but when you compare it to the encouragement, so that same bound exists in the encouragement, but on the encouragement side of the house, there's many people naming women.
Ah, true, right, yeah, that's true.
It's an excellent point though. Any other questions? Hey, Shelly, I see that you dropped in, but you're a bit of an echo.
Oh, so sorry. I thought I was muted.
No worries. Okay. All right. So really great question from the chief there. What we're doing here is we're comparing who people report encourages them to who people report discourages them, and much sort of higher instances of men discouraging women compared to the encouragement side of the house. The thing I think that's really important to key in here, though, is the top line that you see here, overall culture. So the question was, who discouraged you? We anticipated getting results about people. But the most common response we got was really about the agency culture when it comes down to it. You know, my agency isn't supportive of women's success, or I don't think my agency values me as a leader. It was really about the culture specifically, and not about any individual person in the organization, which, as we all know, having an impact on culture is probably the most difficult thing that we're going to be doing in the 30 by 30 initiative. So that's something to just keep in mind. And I'll say that was one of the more surprising results that we had. In terms of why people were discouraged, and again, that's the smaller proportion of people, it was about 17%. I want to highlight that it wasn't always a negative thing. Oh, Steve, I see that, Stephen Lurie, I see that you've got a hand up.
Yeah, thank you so much. Commander Steve Lurie down at LAPD here. I just, as the relative newcomer here, I was wondering if there was any preliminary screening question for people's general satisfaction with their agency. These results look almost suspiciously positive. So I wonder if there's a response bias that the people who answered your survey are people who are generally satisfied. And if there was any way to sort for that by statisticians who are much smarter than I am.
That's a really great question. And I think when we first saw the relatively positive results, we were heartened and also equally not suspicious, but curious. And I think when the researchers do their full analysis on the data, we'll certainly see some information in there about that. You know, the other thing to think about, though, and how they sort of felt a little bit more comfortable with it is it is an opportunity to provide feedback in a way that is really unique and not all that common in a police department. And we were sort of hopeful that the way we presented the survey with very particular language might encourage people who were dissatisfied to be open and honest about it. In addition to that bias that you mentioned, you know, there's also just a risk that people aren't comfortable with the fact that this really is an anonymous survey and might be a little bit less likely to provide negative feedback if it is a survey that's distributed through their department, which is exactly what this was. But excellent flag.
Yeah, 100%. Thanks again. And thanks for welcoming us on board.
Oh yeah, no, thanks so much for being here. So one thing I want to mention about why people discouraged women officers from promoting, it wasn't always necessarily a negative thing. Sometimes it came from a place of really caring about the officer, and the responses were really clear about that. You know, there were all these caveats like, I don't think they necessarily meant to discourage me, but they said X, or I think they said this because they care about me, but they said Y, and it ended up ultimately having a discouraging impact. You know, if you look at it, there's not a lot on here around concerns around performance, right? Those are some of the smallest things on the chart. Really the feedback, and this is a little bit exciting because a lot of it is in control of an agency, is that promoting isn't worth it. Either the increased stress isn't worth the pay that you're going to get, or most commonly, you're going to get a really undesirable shift. Why would you do that? You see one of the quotes here, when you get promoted, you're likely to get a middle shift or a late shift spot. It makes people not want to leave their good shift, and that works with their family, especially as a single mother. None of this is surprising, right? We knew this was something that was a dynamic that was at play, but it is nice to have it sort of be supported by the data. The other thing that came up a lot was balancing family obligations. And that is where that sort of paternalistic, maybe trying to be nice, but ending up not necessarily being all that helpful feedback would come in. Are you sure you want to do this? That's a lot to handle with your kids. You know, I've been discouraged from applying to other positions because of the potential I might become pregnant on light duty. You know, there's a lot of family aspects to why people were discouraged. And then there are the other things that we've been wrestling with in 30 by 30, the idea of tokenism or preferential treatment for people who are an underrepresented group, which is of course, you know, a misperception that we're really trying to combat through this. But there's negative talk from the men in the department about affirmative action and women being gifted answers or knowing the right person to obtain a promotion rather than earning it through merit. And we'll see a little bit more about this when we look at people's specific perceptions of the promotion process in their agency. I'll pause here. Any questions? I really love that people are jumping in. That's what I was hoping would happen. Okay. Just a note, I can't see everyone on my screen. So if you're using a raised hand, I can't necessarily see it. So please feel free to just take yourself off mute and just interrupt as needed. We tried to get at people's motivations for seeking or not seeking promotion. And the reasons why people sought promotion significantly were, I felt like I would make a good leader. It really was just that simple. There's of course the other benefits, right? I wanted to promote as high as I could. I wanted to earn more money. But really it was people's sort of intrinsic sense of their value and ability as a leader that drove them to seek a promotion, which is really, really great to see. And a lot of the reasons about why people haven't sought promotions aren't all that concerning. You know, maybe they want more experience. They're not yet eligible. Maybe they're not interested in the roles that are offered, and that all makes perfect sense. Some of these, though, can be impacted by changes and choices of the department. So things like, I want to keep my current shift. That is something that we can certainly explore, and we'll talk about in just a second. Too many family obligations, you know, that would indicate that perhaps there's an opportunity for the department to think differently about how they're alleviating the burden of having to balance family and careers for women in the job and for men on the job as well. So again, not too many surprises here. There were some concerning things, but they were fairly low. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't focus on them, but I was grateful that there weren't more of them. Things like fear of retaliation, agency doesn't promote women, or agency doesn't promote women of color. Those are things that we obviously need to think about. And there have been some obvious feedback about culture in general that we're going to need to sort of think through. This, I think, is particularly interesting. We asked people what extra steps they took to promote. I imagine none of this is really all that surprising for folks, but by far, the thing that people took advantage of the most was extra training. Also saw a lot of people who were raising their hand for special projects and additional duties to try and get noticed. There were a lot of people who said they intentionally chose a lot of different types of assignments to make sure that they had a really broad, diverse skill set. And then, of course, people pursuing their education for the purposes of making themselves more competitive for promotion. One thing I wanted to mention was the idea of a FaceTime or inside position. We didn't see it in most of the agencies, but in the agencies where we saw it more than once. And that's the last quote that you see here. I found that in order to get promoted, it helped to gain an inside position so commanders got to know your name and face. So I got an inside position. and then I got promoted. Just something to be mindful of. And I will say this is where we ended up in our narrative responses, getting some of the most robust feedback. I think there was a real sense of pride in the respondents of the steps that they were taking to increase their promotability, and it was really inspiring to see. Here's where it gets a little bit less than positive, but not horrible, and that's around perceptions of the promotion process. If you look at this bar chart on the left, right, it's basically a bit of a curve, right? It looks like the representation of believe is fair and strongly believe is fair is sort of like what believe is not fair and strongly believe is not fair. I would posit that neutral is not necessarily something we should celebrate, though. Neutral means that someone was not willing to say that they believe the promotion process is fair. So just keep that in mind as you sort of view these results. We gave people an opportunity to give us more detail about their perception of the process. And this is basically from folks who said neutral or below. And by and large, the biggest concern is favoritism. Again, I can't imagine that that's surprising to anyone, but again, it's nice to see that in the data there. Unfair emphasis is basically people saying we feel like the promotional exams are not testing what it actually takes to be a good leader in that particular position. Again, that's something else that we're trying to address through this initiative, is really sort of aligning assessments with what's needed to do certain positions very well. There was some concern around preferential treatment of minorities in this. That also includes women. And again, that's the tokenism that we're trying to combat. And then inconsiderate towards mothers or gender challenges is largely around if people are balancing work and family life, it would be very difficult for someone who has a primary caretaker role to do the extra work of preparing for the promotional exam. So that's a lot for promotions, like I said, and I'll try and get through this really quickly, but there's a lot of possible implications that you can take with you as you think about how you implement your pledge action items. That big surprise that the biggest sort of discouragement for people was actually the culture and not individual people. That needs attention. If you're an agency that had a sort of high number of people answering culture, that's a great thing to explore through a focus group. And try to really get at how that culture manifests in discouraging impacts. Shift assignments and promotions could be really important. We heard both from people saying they didn't pursue promotions because they didn't want an undesirable shift. We heard people were discouraged from pursuing promotions because of that. And we really need to understand if there are ways to come up with alternate solutions that sort of more equitably distribute the burden of those undesirable shifts. Education about well-intentioned discouragement and gender impacts. That's a note about that sort of paternalistic feedback we were getting. Oh, people were trying to be kind for me and look out for me and basically just tell me because I have a family, I probably can't handle all of this work. That's something that really is something that can be addressed just by overtly naming it, especially because the intention behind it is actually to be helpful. It's just about educating people about what truly helpful behavior looks like. Really great to see that what motivated people to pursue promotion was their own belief in their leadership potential. That really underscores the importance of things like mentorship in fostering that belief in promising candidates. So again, returning to that mentorship slide and encouraging people to reach out to folks like Nolly and ensuring that particularly early career people have folks who are invested in their own success and their knowledge and their own leadership potential. That slide about actions officers were taking to increase their promotability, it'd be interesting to see if what folks are doing in your agency actually squares with what leadership is hoping that they do in order to increase promotability. So if you have an officer who is pursuing a master's degree because they believe it will actually help them in terms of their promotability, is that true? If you have an officer who's taking advantage of every free training that comes down the line, puts their name in the hat for every training there is that actually what's expected in order to be qualified for that next job? So doing a crosswalk between what your qualifications and expectations are and how your women officers are preparing to be competitive for promotional opportunities is an important thing to do. Finally, reviewing promotional processes and outcomes for fairness and transparency. That's obviously a fundamental element of what we're trying to do here with the pledge. But the perceptions of the promotional processes, by and large, they weren't horrible, but they weren't great. And I'd imagine nobody wants to be in an agency where the basic feeling about the process is we're not quite willing to say that it's a fair process. So again, focus groups are really helpful there in understanding how that manifests. We had a host of questions around things like representation and respect. And again, we're positively surprised by the answers that we got there. satisfied with the representation of women and satisfied with the representation of racial and ethnic minorities. It's just good to understand, the perspectives of the women that are currently working on the force. And again, those are both fairly positive or trending in positive way. Same with women in my agency are respected by women officers. Women in my agencies are respected by men officers. Again, here's slightly more on the disagree side from men officers, but not a huge difference in terms of perceptions around respect generally. Women in my agency are respected by supervisors and command staff. Again, largely positive. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't necessarily be worried about the number of respondents who disagree that women are respected by their supervisors, but there is sort of reason for hope there as well. Finally, I want to get on the harassment slide because it is, I think, really interesting and different than what research has shown. So there's research out there that shows that women officers, that 93% of women officers report experiencing harassment at some point in their career. Our sample size showed only 56% reported having experienced harassment. And we use the EEOC definition of harassment. Same for having witnessed harassment. And of those who witnessed it, they had to choose between very frequently, often, and sometimes being the least often, and most chose sometimes. So those are encouraging numbers. I'm cautiously encouraged by them. I think there's a lot more digging that we need to do because it is so different than the other research that's out there. And we just want to make sure we understand why that is and ensure that those data are accurately reflecting what's happening to our officers. Where I think there's more reason for concern is in perception of agency response to harassment. So I will tell you, even in agencies that scored really highly across the board and didn't have as much named in terms of problematic culture, for example, there were still a lot of concerns about agency response to harassment. That was pretty universal. If your agency scored well here, you should know you're definitely in the significant minority. That bottom line that's in gold, that's a positive sentiment. Everything in blue is a negative sentiment. I know those blue points are a little bit hard to read. This was, again, a narrative text field, so we ended up identifying themes, but basically the themes boil down to the agency doesn't take it seriously. If the agency takes actions, it's inconsistent. Concerningly, there's an informal policy or no harassment policy at the agency. They have a policy, but it ends up ultimately being harmful. And the agency culture is such that people are discouraged from reporting, or there's barriers to reporting. In terms of possible implications, this again is a huge priority for the 30 by 30 pledge, but a policy review is likely helpful here. And if you don't have a policy, certainly getting one in place of how to respond to and receive complaints of harassment. If you feel like you have either a substandard policy or no policy, and you're looking for examples, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. We can try and find other agencies who are participating in 30 by 30 who are either in a similar geographic location, hopefully the same state so that you have any type of state legal requirements reflected, and of a similar size, and we can get you examples. The flip side of that, if you feel like your agency has a really robust harassment policy and you're really happy with it, you got high scores if you've done your survey, and you'd be willing to share it on the 30 by 30 Google group, I think that would be hugely helpful. In terms of the elements of a good policy, consistency and transparency in the process, all of these are no brainer, and I know you all know this, but just to get it out there, very clear reporting requirements that make the expectations and timelines clear, appropriate protections for people reporting. And again, this is going to be different depending on your agency and where you are located. If you're not sure if your protections are appropriate, a great way to ascertain that is to have conversations and focus groups with the people most likely to require those protections and get their feedback about what it could and should look like. A no tolerance example from leadership sets the tone for the culture. And again, that's another element of the pledge, but making it clear from the top that harassment isn't tolerated and that reporting is encouraged and protected. Wow. Any questions on that? Okay, the last slide, and thank you for sticking with me. I know it's a lot of information that I'm throwing at you, is around family leave. And I think this is particularly, hold on just one second. Okay, there we go. This is particularly helpful for some of the pledge elements. We asked about what stage of career people first had children. I don't think any of this is surprising. You could probably intuit it based on what you've seen in your own agency. 50% had their first kid while they were on patrol. 33% had their first kid prior to sworn, but again, that doesn't mean that they didn't have children once they were joined the force as well. 14% was other, and 4% they were already at a supervisory level. That'll have impacts that we'll talk about in a second. Again, like the harassment, the perceptions of family leave is not overwhelmingly positive. Again, that gold bar is a positive response. The rest of the blue bars are sort of pursed out negative responses. So agency is not supportive of people taking family leave. Agency is perhaps too supportive of people taking family leave, and it's open to abuse. There's unequal or inconsistent support. The leave policies that are in place are insufficient, or there's obstacles for accessing them. There's a perception that taking the family leave will actually stagnate your career. The culture is one where people feel guilty about taking that leave, or people take advantage of the policies outright. In terms of possible implications here, it's a very simplistic thing that I know is actually very complicated, but reviewing policies and identifying opportunities for increased support, I think some of these pledge elements that we have, they will help get you there and fill in those gaps. One thing I just want to mention is, we had a couple people write in that the policy wasn't sufficient, but they were happy because at least it met the basic minimum standards for their state. And just really encouraging people to think of those standards as the floor and not the ceiling. I have not yet heard of a state in this country whose parental leave policies are so sufficient that they provide what is commonly known to be needed for people who need leave. So if you are meeting your mandatory minimums, that's great. But if there's a way to build on that, this would certainly be something that we would love to help with. If you're making incremental change on how you're sort of supporting family leave, if you're trying new things, if you're going to do things like maybe sharing shifts or part-time options or anything like that, we highly encourage you to start with patrol. That's where you'll have the most difference, and that's where there's the greatest need. Things to think about: is there a way that you can better support parents who are returning to the workplace on patrol specifically? Again, that part-time shift option, or at least shift stability, to improve the likelihood that parents are able to obtain childcare. There was an agency in the UK, I think it was Manchester, that recently launched a part-time shift option, basically hiring sworn police officers at 50% of the time. They'd had one cohort, and I think it was 24 of the cohort were women and 4 were men. And they were assuming that that was largely because of the benefits of part-time work for people who are primary caregivers. The other thing to really just think through, and again, this is one of the fundamental elements of the pledge, is what is your plan for nursing mothers returning on patrol? Mamava is an organization that we heard a little bit about because of their work with the Vermont State Police. They actually have an app that not only shows where their nursing pods are located in any given state. So, you could get one of their pods, but people can also populate the app with where there's a nursing station in other public buildings. So they were recommending, because policing is a public institution, that you can actually work to get nursing stations in things like City Hall or the courthouse, not necessarily trying to get one in every precinct if that's not likely, but at least getting some that are near enough to where people would be on patrol, that they have multiple options for where they can stop and pump if needed. So again, Mamava is a great resource for that. We'll probably be hearing from them sometime in the new year. They'll do a deep dive into the services they offer. But if that's a priority for you and you're not sure where to start and you want to get started right away, shoot me an email and I'll connect you with them directly. All right.